Archaeologists did not set out to challenge the Bible. They were cataloging fragments, stones, tiles, everyday objects, left behind by early Christian communities in the land where Jesus once walked. But among these ordinary finds, something unexpected appeared. Short sayings attributed to Jesus that do not appear in the Gospels. They are not sermons, not parables, just brief lines, remembered, repeated, and preserved in places no one thought to look. This immediately raises a simple but unsettling question. If these words were known to early believers, why were they never written into Scripture? Today's story follows those discoveries step by step, not to debate faith or doctrine, but to understand how memory worked in the earliest Christian world and what happens when spoken words outlive written ones. The discoveries did not come from a single dramatic dig or a headline-grabbing announcement. They emerged slowly, piece by piece, from routine archaeological work across Israel and surrounding regions. Excavations near ancient villages, roads, and early gathering places began turning up objects that were never meant to last. Broken tiles, stone fragments, scraps were used in walls, surfaces scratched by hand. On several of these surfaces were short inscriptions, not prayers, not names of emperors, just a few words, written plainly. And in more than one case, those words were attributed directly to Jesus. This immediately stood out to researchers for one simple reason. These were not written in the style of Scripture. They were not framed as stories. There was no narrative context, just short lines, sometimes no longer than a sentence, written as if the reader already knew who Jesus was. That tells us something important. These inscriptions were not meant to introduce Jesus. They were meant to remind people of something he had already said. Most of these fragments date to the 1st and early 2nd century. That places them within living memory of Jesus' lifetime, or just one generation removed. At that point, Christianity was not yet centered on books. It was centered on people who had heard stories directly or from someone they trusted. What makes these finds unusual is where they appear. Not in synagogues or formal worship spaces, but in ordinary locations, communal areas, roadside structures, even domestic settings. This suggests these sayings circulated as part of everyday life, not formal teaching. The content itself is striking in its simplicity. There are no theological explanations, no references to prophecy, no attempt to prove anything. Instead, the words sound practical, immediate, and personal, closer to advice than doctrine. That alone helps explain why they were never recorded in the Gospels. The Gospel writers were not trying to document every sentence Jesus ever spoke. They were shaping narratives meant to be read aloud, remembered, and shared across communities. They selected teachings that carried theological weight, narrative power, and communal significance. Short situational remarks, spoken to individuals in passing, would not have fit that purpose. But archaeology shows they were remembered anyway. Another detail matters here. These inscriptions are not identical to one another. They show slight variations in wording. That strongly suggests oral transmission. People remembered the meaning, not the exact phrasing. They passed it on the way humans naturally do, by repetition, not transcription. This aligns perfectly with what historians already know about 1st century Jewish teaching culture. Rabbis taught through constant repetition. Students memorized sayings, not texts. Writing was expensive. Literacy was limited. Memory did the work that paper would later replace. Jesus operated entirely within that world. So when we ask why certain words were never written down, the answer may be simpler than it sounds. Writing was not the primary method of preservation. Speech was. These discoveries do not reveal a secret Jesus. They reveal a familiar one. Speaking often, speaking briefly, speaking to individuals whose names we will never know. And that leads to the next question. If these words survive without being written, how much else was remembered but eventually lost? To understand why these words survived at all, we have to step back into the world Jesus lived in. This was not a culture built around books. It was built around voices. Most people in 1st century Judea could not read or write fluently. Writing materials were costly, fragile, and rare. But memory was trained. From childhood, people learned by listening, repeating, and recalling. Stories were not owned by paper. They were carried by people. Jesus taught entirely within that system. He did not sit down to write. He walked, spoke, responded, corrected, encouraged. His words were often short because short sentences are easier to remember. They stick, they travel, they survive being passed from one mouth to another. Early followers did not experience Jesus as a text. They experienced him as a presence. That matters because it explains why so many sayings could circulate freely without ever being fixed in writing. A person hears a line that strikes them. They repeat it to their family. Someone else repeats it slightly differently. The meaning stays, the wording shifts. This is exactly what researchers see in the archaeological fragments. The sayings are familiar in tone, but not frozen in form. They feel remembered, not copied. For decades after Jesus' death, this oral network was enough. Communities gathered, retold stories, and repeated sayings they believed mattered most. There was no urgency to write everything down because the people who knew the stories were still alive. The Gospels only began to take shape when that situation changed. As eyewitnesses aged and communities spread farther apart, memory alone was no longer sufficient. Writing became necessary but selective. Authors had to decide what to include and what to leave out. They chose material that served a clear purpose, to explain who Jesus was, why he mattered, and what his life meant. That meant prioritizing parables, confrontations, miracles, and major teachings. Everyday remarks did not disappear because they were unimportant. They disappeared because they were not essential to the structure of the story being told. But within local communities, those smaller sayings continued to circulate. They were remembered precisely because they felt personal. A line spoken to a worker, a brief correction offered quietly, a simple instruction repeated in daily life. These were not the words people debated. They were the words people used. That also explains why such sayings show up on objects meant for daily use rather than formal texts. They were reminders, not proclamations. Something to glance at, something already understood. Over time, as Christianity became more organized, more institutional, and more text-centered, this oral layer faded. What was written became authoritative. What was remembered became informal. Eventually, it became invisible. Archaeology is now catching fragments of that invisible layer. And when we see it, the image of Jesus subtly shifts, not away from the Gospels, but closer to the ground, closer to real conversations, real moments, and real people. Which raises the most important question yet. If these words were remembered and trusted, why did later generations stop paying attention to them? When people hear that some words of Jesus were never written down, the first assumption is often suspicion. It sounds like exclusion, like censorship, but the historical reality is far less dramatic and far more human. The early church was not sitting on a pile of forgotten sayings deciding what to hide. It was trying to survive. In the first centuries, Christian communities were scattered, vulnerable, and often persecuted. Writing something down was not a casual act. Once words were fixed in text, they could be copied, challenged, misused, or misunderstood. Leaders had to be careful about what they preserved as authoritative. So when the gospel writers set out to write, they were not compiling a complete archive of everything Jesus ever said. They were telling a story with a purpose. Each gospel answers a specific question. Who is Jesus? Why was he executed? What does his life mean? How should his followers live? To answer those questions, the authors selected material that carried weight across communities, not just meaning for one individual in one moment. That immediately disqualified many types of speech. A short sentence spoken privately, a practical remark about daily behavior, a line that only made sense in a specific situation. These things were powerful in the moment, but fragile outside of it. Written down, they would lose context. Worse, they could be misapplied. There is also something else at work, memory hierarchy in oral cultures. Not all memories are treated equally. Some stories are meant to be performed publicly. Others are meant to stay local. The Gospels preserve what was preached widely. Archaeology hints at what was lived quietly. As the church grew, it also had to define boundaries. Different groups began circulating texts and sayings, some authentic, some altered, some exaggerated. To maintain unity, leaders leaned more heavily on established writings tied to apostolic authority. That process was not about erasing Jesus' voice, it was about stabilizing it. By the time Christianity became centered on Scripture, the balance had shifted. What was written became primary. What was remembered became secondary. Over generations, the unwritten layer faded almost completely, but it never vanished entirely. It lingered in habits, phrases, and community memory until time erased most traces. What archaeology is now uncovering are rare survivors of that world, not rejected teachings, not hidden messages, just echoes of speech that once lived comfortably without ink. And that leads us to a final realization. The Gospels do not limit Jesus' voice, they frame it. Which brings us to the closing question. What do these missing words actually change for us today? These discoveries do not rewrite the story of Jesus. They clarify it. What archaeology reveals is not a gap in the Gospels, but the space around them. The written texts were never meant to capture every sentence, every interaction, or every quiet moment. They were meant to preserve meaning, not transcripts. Seeing that Jesus' words once lived freely, spoken, remembered, repeated, changes how we read what was written. It reminds us that faith began as something heard before it was read, that teachings were lived before they were organized, that influence does not require permanence to be real. The missing words do not challenge Scripture. They highlight its purpose. The Gospels are not incomplete because they left things out. They are focused because they chose what to include. And perhaps the deeper lesson is this. What lasts is not always what is written down. Sometimes it is what changes how people live, even when no one records it. So the question is not what else Jesus might have said, but which of his words are still shaping lives today, even if we can no longer trace them back to stone or ink. What do you think matters more? The words that survived on the page or the ones that survived in people? Share your thoughts in the comments.